I enjoyed David's talk. I'm not sure that I enjoyed very much the talk of the previous speaker, because I have a great deal of disagreement with him and what I've seen and what I've done and what I've learned in the last few years. I'm an ear, nose, and throat doctor, but my wife was an Indian chief. She was the principal chief of the largest Native American tribe in the state when the oil spill occurred. And most of her constituents, most of her tribal people were people that worked in the oil field and were fishermen. Her father was a lifelong fisherman and so forth. And with the advent of the spill, we were really curious about the health of the people that were involved with it, because right after the spill there were some news articles that showed that a lot of people went to the hospital and were checked for this. And we asked and asked and asked amongst our family members, okay, because the tribe is one big family, 17,000 member family. And we didn't really find very much. And then I got a call from a woman by the name of Mary Lee Orr. Mary Lee Orr is the executive director of the largest environmental group in the state. And Mary asked me if I'd draw some VOCs on a number of patients she had that she was convinced were ill from the spill. And so that began my spending the last over 3 years, day in and day out, working on this issue. I learned a lot, and it reinforced a lot of what I knew already. We were talking about the number of barrels of oil that was spilled, and if you noticed, Dr. Mason, was it? Mm-hmm. Had 5,000 barrels, and then the first presenter had 250,000 barrels, and then Mr. Lincoln had a different number of barrels, and nobody seems to be able to determine what was happening over there. Well, spilled in my environment, the environment I grew up in, were 5 million barrels of oil, okay? We had 5 million barrels of oil that was spilled in the Gulf of Mexico. And there was approximately 2 million gallons of dispersant used. Now, we learned since the spill that this dispersant is highly toxic in and of itself, but it's a proprietary thing, so nobody really knows what's in it. And I think they do know what's in it now. But it is still legal to use, in spite of the fact that it caused an untold amount of misery and health-related issues in our community. This was the largest oil spill reported worldwide in history. And just recently, they found a 40,000-pound oil mat right in the middle of one of the most productive estuary complexes in the world, which is where I live, in the Gulf of Mexico, right next to the Gulf, in a small town that's, well, we don't live right next to it, but pretty close to the Gulf of Mexico. This is where I grew up on this, on the coastal area and in that environment. I initially met with about a dozen people at my office in Raceland, and I began drawing blood for the first time in 40 years or so. And there was a young child from Pensacola that had been in Pensacola and had gotten extremely ill, came home and had to be admitted to the hospital. They didn't know what the hell he had. Sick as a dog, thought it was a renal disorder. They operated on him. And eventually his father, I understand Baton Rouge is the center of Exxon. Exxon has a huge refinery in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the father asked his doctor, he said, is it possible that my son got sick from being in the water in Pensacola? What I didn't tell you about the story was that the child was swimming in a swimming pool adjacent to the Gulf when they were cleaning booms on the beach where he was swimming in this pool. And when he asked the doctor this, the physician immediately got very defensive and so forth, and the next day the child was discharged from the hospital, okay? To the best of my knowledge, he is doing reasonably well, but the father's worried sick about any potential problems for the future. This was another child, another 3-year-old, who had splotches on her skin, and these pictures were taken when she was in the office at that time. And she and her sister were both extremely ill, as were her mother and father, with various and sundry symptoms that we're going to get to in a moment. After the initial phase of me seeing these people in my office, by the way, one young man was having seizures. I think I'll get to this in a minute. But what I later saw was that people from Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana all had identical symptoms, identical problems. And I suspect that you guys are going to have identical problems too from the exposures that you had. When I get in this later on, you may be able to see some of these things. And I'll have some of this available for you, some of these symptoms that you can learn a little bit from on the website that I'll give to you. I'm a voracious reader, and I read 5 or 6 newspapers a day. I cut out clippings, I scan them, put them in the computer, and so forth. I've been overwhelmed lately and haven't been able to keep up with it. But for the spill, rather than just cutting out the clippings, I took and I laminated the entire articles. I can show you about 50 pounds of laminated paper where there's articles on fish, shrimps, ducks, pelicans, porpoises, what have you, name it. But you're not going to find a single article on human health problems. Not a single article. They have managed to suppress the illnesses that people have been suffering from that well. The Huffington Post and, of all things, Al Jazeera covered this very well, and they were the only publications that covered it to any significant degree. Now, this wasn't my first rodeo. I had been in the state senate fighting the oil and gas industry when they had delivered, I had a small Native American community called Grand Bois, Louisiana, where they had been delivering toxic materials from Escambia, Alabama. And they had brought in this material. It was so toxic, it was like this heavy crude that you're talking about, that they had a convoy of trucks, and the back trucks, the drivers were getting so sick that they played leapfrog all the way to Grand Bois, Louisiana, and that the back trucks would pass the front trucks up because the guys in the back were getting sick. When they got to Grand Bois and started emptying these trucks into the pit, they had what we call land farming. They allow you to take oil field waste and put it in open pits, and then they put some chemicals in it and they agitate it with a backhoe with a propeller on it and so forth, and they do this type of things. Well, they were dumping this in the pit. The pit was illegally close to a residence, just 300 feet, less than 300 feet from the residence, where a little girl, and that's the story I'm not going to have time to go into, was extremely, extremely ill. And people were falling out from this. They had a reporter who was out there who actually passed out and had to be rushed to the hospital. And all the community members everyone was overwhelmed by this. I was later to learn that there was nothing illegal about what they were doing, okay? And I'll explain to you what that is involved with. This is the 23, I think, page report that I wrote on this for the Senate Committee on the oil field waste. And it was, I'm sure nobody in the industry or anywhere else has read the damn thing, but it was done in 1998. So I've been around this for a while. This was such an interesting story that 60 Minutes came down and did 60 minutes. I've never seen 60 Minutes do a 60-minute segment. But 60 Minutes did a 60-minute segment on this issue. And I'm going to play for you a few minutes of that program because it's got some information on it that's going to make your hair stand on end a little bit. And tell you why a lot of what went into your yards and your homes is not regulated by OSHA and may not even be illegal for them to have done. Okay. Well, we're going to lose out on a couple of very, very nice films that I have over here. But anyway, during the course of this presentation, Carol Browner, who was the head of the Environmental Protection Agency at the time, describes how the Environmental Protection Agency, which in 1972, I think, was given the mandate that they were going to regulate the handling, transportation, and storage of hazardous materials. And the oil and gas industry immediately got an exemption promising that they were going to do a study. In 1976, in the Reagan administration, the study was performed, and the study showed that there was no problems with oil and gas materials being hazardous. And so they created a new category of waste called NOW, non-hazardous oil field waste. And basically what the law said, that anything that was a result of the exploration and production of petroleum products was non-hazardous by definition. Okay, it was NOW. Well, Carol Browner explains during this program that not only was this stuff hazardous, it was highly hazardous. and it was not regulated by the EPA. They lied on the study that was done. The lady who actually did the study, a woman by the name of Carla Greathouse, actually made a presentation, and she described how the scientists had come up with a conclusion that several parts of the oil field waste stream, there's 16 different parts of the oil field waste stream, which I know from having written papers on it, and 4 of the components of the stream are highly toxic. And so she said the report came out, it got to the political side of this, Congress changed the report, they passed the law. So we're going to see in a few minutes where, in spite of all of this, and we'll see how this plays out in a real life situation that I've actually lived through. And here's the disappearing report. Here's the report that I printed out years ago in Bound and so forth, and the report that says there's no problem with this stuff when actually everyone knows that it's highly toxic. Okay, and here's a booklet. The EPA was stuck because I'm sure the scientists and the people who worked at the EPA were not happy with the fact that this material was considered non-hazardous. So, and they were responsible for illnesses with this, so they had to write something saying that, look, this non-hazardous stuff can possibly be hazardous, and so forth. So this is some of the parts of that study that says that hazardous materials, non-hazardous materials can certainly be hazardous. So here's a simple rule of thumb for identifying uniquely associated waste is whether the waste came from downhole or otherwise was generated in contact with the oil or gas production stream for the purpose of removing water or other contaminants from the well or the products. So basically anything that's a result of the exploration and production of petroleum products is non-hazardous by definition. Now, where does that become a problem? Well, Thad Allen, who was the admiral who was in charge of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill cleanup aspect, was asked in an interview what chemicals were used, what antifreezes were used in the oil spill. And let me explain to you why they use antifreezes. Antifreeze is necessary when you're drilling down to 5,000 feet. The water is below 32 degrees down there. And the hydrates, the water that comes up with the methane gas and the oil and so forth, freezes and blocks the riser. The riser is the name of the pipe that comes from the bottom of the Gulf into the ships that are storing the oil. Well, what they use in these things is methanol, which is wood alcohol, the wood alcohol, 10 cc's will blind you, 30 cc's will kill you, okay? They also use ethylene glycol, which is a regular antifreeze. And any of you have had problems with your neighbor's dogs may have heard of somebody putting a little antifreeze on a weenie, putting it out there, and the dogs die pretty quickly from it. We don't do that back home, but we've all heard of it. So these are extremely, extremely powerful chemicals. And what's happened with this was that during the spill, here we got a little date on that. During the spill, they were using Corexit. Some of you may have recalled seeing the pictures of the oil coming out of the pipe at the bottom of the Gulf, and it's spewing in the water, those 5 million barrels that were spilled. And when it came out, they were putting ethylene glycol in it, millions of gallons of it. They were putting methanol in it, millions of gallons in it. And I think they used $2 million gallons of Corexit, which is this toxic dispersant that they used. And all of this stuff floated to the surface. And when it got to the surface, what happened to it? They burned it, okay? And so you had ethylene glycol, methanol, Louisiana light crude, which is highly toxic in and of itself, and they had these other, and then you had the Corexit, and then you burned it, and God only knows what it created past that point. But all of those materials were burned, and I think I've got some pictures of this also in here. Now this is a booklet put out by BP, and the comments were made by a couple of people that none of the workers wore masks. And somebody said, Ricky Ott said that they didn't allow them to use masks in Alaska. Every person I talked to, and understand that my patients were people that worked on the boats that cleaned up the spills and so forth, every person I talked to was told that if they were caught wearing a mask, they would be fired. And if anyone on the boat was caught wearing a mask, the boats would be fired also from the jobs. Now, Nowco, which is a company that makes Corexit, okay, this dispersant that was used primarily out there, Nowco has a brochure that they put out before the spill that says you should wear respirators when you're dealing with these things. One of the workers got hold of it and let this get out. But Nowco has these things, and it's in their own brochure, it's in their own material, and yet that was the case. This is a all-spill emergency response booklet put out by BP itself, and it talks about routes of absorption of this material, and it talks about Louisiana light crude. And by the way, you can fingerprint and do DNA or do DNA, whatever symbolic comment you want to make with it. You can take oil from anywhere in the Gulf that's come up to the surface, and you can tell where it came from because it's fairly specific in its content to the sites of its origin. And Louisiana light crude inhalation may be fatal if inhaled, and can cause a whole bunch of other symptoms and so forth and so on, and known to cause cancer. So this is when they burned the material when it got to the surface. What they did was they surrounded the oil with these large booms, and then they had what was called a burn boat that went in, threw Molotov cocktail type of material in there, and burned it, and then where this stuff went was wherever the wind brought it. And it could have been 100 miles or hundreds of miles away from the surface. During the course of the spill, I received a call from a man, and he said, look, you need to read my book. He said, the symptoms that your patients are having are identical to the symptoms that people had from the 91 Gulf War, from the Gulf War, the 91 Gulf War. And we had about between 175,000 and 200,000 troopers come back. 1 out of every 4 troopers came back with what was known as Gulf War illness or Gulf War syndrome. The symptoms that they had were absolutely identical to the symptoms that my patients had with BP syndrome, identical symptoms. And at first I thought, well, this was from the oil that they burned in Kuwait. It had absolutely nothing to do with this. It had to do with certain other chemicals that we used that were related chemically to the organophosphates poisons that we were afraid of during the Gulf War, sarin. These are organophosphate poisons, and they're the same class of poisons that were used in industrial strength insecticides that the soldiers put on their clothing and left on their clothing for weeks on end, keep the gnats and flies off them and so forth. And it was also chemically related to one of the pills that they were given to prevent problems from the gas exposures, okay? And it happens to be the same type of material as the gas itself. The theory being that if we give this pill to them, this pill is reversible, whereas the gas is not reversible. And it's a medicine that is used clinically to treat a condition called myasthenia gravis. But they'd never encountered a problem with it because they were treating just sick people with it, and thinking that they could use it on healthy people, and it turned out that that wasn't the case. So why did only 1 out of every 4 person get sick? Why did some people in Mayflower get sick and others not get sick at all? We know that there's some enzymes that some of us possess that others of us do not possess. And these enzymes are enzymes that allow your body to break down these chemicals much more readily than otherwise. And so people that have adequate amounts of these enzymes, one of the enzymes that they cited was PON1 or peroxidase. Not that that means anything to you or to me, but it's just that these things are present in some people, and that gives us an answer for this. I'm a clinician, I'm a guy that treats people and so forth. So having drawn about 100 people's blood for volatile organic compounds, I did not discuss the test results with a single one. I sent them to doctors that were more familiar with this and people that were more familiar with it, because I've never claimed to be a toxicologist or anything else. I'm a clinician, I treat people, I assess them as best I can clinically, and so forth. What we learned from the from the Gulf War experience was that the illnesses that these people suffered from, that these soldiers suffered from, and by the way, they came back and were considered malingerers, malcontents, and so forth, and they have never been treated for their illnesses. They have never been treated, and they've just recently been recognized as actually having illnesses. So these people came back and we patted ourselves on the back. We said what great heroes they were. It was so much nicer than when they came back from Vietnam and they were spat on and so forth and so on. Well, we did even worse to those people than we did to the kids from Vietnam. Although the Vietnam era had something very similar, and that was Agent Orange contamination and so forth, which we ignored, and we said the same thing about them when they initially got home. There's a 2008, the Gulf War was in 91. In 2008, a Senate committee came up with a report on Gulf War illness, and we can call that BP syndrome. We can call that Mayflower syndrome, okay? If you guys are having the same type of symptoms at all. And it was a blistering article, and it explained a lot of what I've subsequently learned from this. And we're going to go over these symptoms that they complained of with this in just a minute. But Gulf War syndrome had this list of problems. But when I compared Gulf War syndrome to BP syndrome, this is what I came up with, okay? The blue would be the BP syndrome, the Gulf War syndrome would be the left, and you can see that they're almost identical symptoms. And this my study came out of 115 patients, 113 people that I tested, and that we treated rather, and the other one came from the studies that were done in this article. And by the way, in the article, they lambasted the Veterans Department, Department of Defense, for not taking better care of the veterans and for running about $750 million worth of studies that were designed not to reveal that there was anything going on. So here's some more information on that. Okay, for those of you that might be interested, let me tell you what we experienced. And this is Gulf War, this could be BP, okay? This complex of multiple concurrent symptoms typically include persistent memory and concentration problems. Really, really prominent with what we saw. Chronic headaches, widespread aches and pains, gastrointestinal problems, and chronic abnormalities not explained by well-established diagnosis. No effective treatment has been identified for Gulf War illness, and studies indicate few veterans have recovered over time. Now, I'm going to take issue with the second to last statement, and that is that no effective treatment has been discovered for this, and tell you that Dr. David Root, who is my mentor, after seeing the original wave of people come in, some fella came up to me with this cock and bull story that he had a treatment in which he could detoxify patients and could get them better with BP syndrome. And I'm saying, But my wife and I were desperate, and we had nowhere else to turn. So we decided that we were going to give this program, a detox program, a go. So we took our family home, we put a couple of huge saunas in there, and I spent a whole year treating patients with this. The treatment protocol calls for about a year of going into sauna treatments every day. You'd exercise, you'd take a lot of niacin, which would dilate your blood vessels and help you to sweat. And then you spend about 5 hours in a 180-degree sauna sweating, okay? And within a few days, I started seeing miracles happen. I mean, I've never seen anything. I've been a doctor for over 40 years. And I love my work, I love my practice. But I've never seen anything remotely as dramatic as that. And I had, it's a shame that this thing won't play one of these videos, because I have pictures of 3 ladies that had just absolutely amazing results from their treatment. We called them the 3 amigos, and their results were wonderful. Okay, so well, let me jump back and go. They said no effective treatment has been identified for Gulf War illness. And here's another statement that says that the studies were not designed to help the veterans, they were designed to make it look like nothing, that they had nothing. So The problem that we found with this is that, number one, none of my patients had any money. None of them had insurance, and also we were doing this largely pro bono. And the second thing was, we learned from the Gulf War studies as well as our own experiences that those people that could afford studies, the studies didn't show anything. It took specialized studies, very expensive specialized testing to be able to show that there was actually problems occurring. Okay, here's, during the course of this, and here's the politics of it, and here's where the real frustration comes in. The federal judge who was in charge of this case set up a situation where a class action lawsuit could be filed, and rather than people going into court individually, they could go in as a class. And if you met certain criteria, you could receive some compensation for your illness. And he appointed 19 attorneys to what was called the Plaintiff Steering Committee. And the Plaintiff Steering Committee negotiated with BP and decided what illnesses were going to be considered compensable, which illnesses you're going to be able to get money for a BP syndrome. There were two classifications, there are two categories of this. One was the compensation from material losses for businesses and so forth, the fishermen and so forth. And the other one was for health issues. And under the health issues, they had two categories. One was acute problems, the other was the chronic problems. Well, I didn't treat the acute problems because all of my patients were at least a year away from the spill with their illnesses. When they came out with the symptoms that they were going to compensate people for, they had a preliminary report. None of the top 10 illnesses that I saw were included in the report. And this isn't me making up these illnesses. This is going into every one of their records and taking out the most common symptoms that they had and putting them in order and so forth. And so nothing over there was going to be compensable. Now, when you're making your comments about knowledge is power, I learned when I was in the Louisiana legislature, I went there thinking knowledge was power. I left there saying money is power, okay? Because that's where it's all about. The people that have it, it's a golden rule. The guys with the gold get to make the rules. And certainly that was a situation with this situation also. Now, my best friend is this gray-haired attorney over here. His name is Leroy Hartley, a wonderful guy. He's worked with me on a lot of different missions in years past, trying to be do-gooders and so forth and get good legislation and various and sundry things accomplished. And Lee was assuring me that the federal judge in this case was an honest and honorable man, and we were counting on that to be the case. Well, the federal judge, I wrote 5 different letters to the judge, and I explained everything that, and then he and I went to the court hearing where they were deciding whether or not they were going to accept this agreement between BP and the attorneys for the things that were going to be compensable for BP syndrome. And it was obvious at the hearing that he was not going to be taking the side of the plaintiffs. He was going to be taking the side of BP and do this. So when he eventually made his ruling, I took all of my data, thinking I could do this overnight, and it took me about a week and a half of every afternoon after work of taking my data and abstracting the illnesses from it and coming up with this report. And so over here, you look at the symptoms that they had. And by the way, that's basically the same symptoms that people had with BP syndrome, with Gulf War syndrome, and so forth. So one of the things I want to point out to y'all, because it's a common comment that people make, and they talk about pulmonary problems, okay? I saw no pulmonary problems. I saw no chronic pulmonary problems. I saw a few acute pulmonary problems, but everybody that had acute pulmonary problems had cleared up. So almost every time I hear people discuss the exposure problems, they talk about the pulmonary problems, and that was not my experience. Far from it, because pulmonary problems were way, way, way down the line of things that I saw. Memory loss was profound. I had a really interesting experience a couple of weeks ago. I had a young lady come to the office. Her mother had been a patient of mine since she was a child. And the child had a bunch of symptoms and had seen 5 or 6 different doctors and had not gotten any improvement with things. And so she brings it to her ear, nose, and throat doctor who's going to solve all of her problems, obviously. Well, she just lucked up on that one because the child had classic BP syndrome. I went to my office and I printed out that little sheet that I've got on the slide right now. And I discussed it with her. Now let me tell you what this lady did, and it was absolutely magnificent. I explained to her that since we didn't have anything to tie this to BP and the oil spill, that she probably was having a toxic exposure from a lot of other things because many, many other things can cause the same symptoms. So the mother went home that evening and had a discussion with the daddy. A lot of these people that had BP syndrome had blood sugar problems. Their blood sugar would bounce up and down, and blood sugar bouncing up and down frequently causes any ear problems and dizziness, which is something I recognized right off the bat. Everybody that came in our treatment program, the 113 people that came through the program, as soon as they got in the program, they were told to graze. I wanted them grazing. I wanted them eating multiple meals, multiple times a day, small meals, but it was the only way to keep the blood sugar from falling down, and all of my complaints of dizziness and all went away almost immediately. So this mother had gone home that night and ran a 5-hour glucose tolerance test on her daughter, had a nice discussion with her husband, and when she came back the next day with the daughter and we went over the test results, and she did have some low blood sugar episodes, or she did have low blood sugar, and she said, the daughter said, I slept for the first time in several months. I had a good night's sleep. What the mother had do was, when they went home, they discussed the fact that they had recently painted the bedroom about a year ago, right before the symptoms started. And they could still smell in the sheetrock some of the paint. And so she had her daughter sleep in the next room, and the child felt a lot better the next day. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about, we have a lot of endocrine problems with this, a lot of endocrine problems in children, too, things that we don't get to see. But we can tell you in adults and adolescents and so forth, the women have menstrual problems. A lot of men that we saw were impotent and so forth. It was a little interesting. Of course, I didn't press the men very much on that because it's a delicate subject for me to broach. But the wives would say more about it than the husband would actually say. And nobody seemed to be concerned about the embarrassment or anything because a fact was a fact. Well, anyway, this little girl hadn't menstruated in 6 months. And so the mama told me the next day, she said, we decided we're gonna tear out the sheetrock, we're gonna put some paneling in. I said, well, the paneling can possibly cause some problems. So, and I also talked to her about how we used the sauna before and so forth. I didn't go into great detail with it, but just told us how it would work for the people that I'd been treating. So when the mother came back 2 or 3 days later, they had, maybe a week later, to see how she had done. They had already, within 4 days, they had torn the sheetrock out and had put the paneling in the room. But when they went shopping for the paneling, the little girl got sick when she went with them from inhaling the formaldehyde or whatever else was in the paneling. And but when they came back 6 days later, and I'll skip this part. The mother, in the meantime, had found a place about 50 miles from where they lived, where they had saunas, that they would let the daughter use the sauna. So she went to this health club or something, used the sauna. When they came back 6 days later, they had done all of this work, completely revamped the bedroom, and the child was menstruating and felt perfectly normal again. This is a child that has seen multiple doctors, multiple times, and so forth. So it was absolutely, it was really a rewarding thing. It was the first non-BP person I treated with this. One of the things that people develop with this, and we would be seeing this if we had, we could have used these videos that I had, but they develop multiple chemical sensitivities. And things that may have never bothered you before, once you've gone through a toxic exposure like this, will suddenly bother you. So one of my patients, and this is a guy that was, I had to go through the program myself to administer the program. So I spent 25 days in a sauna exercising and sweating by myself. It was miserable. And the biggest thing was I was doing it on my own while I was working full time at the same time. But one of the guys that came through the program with me, his name is Jory, and Jory is quite a character. He was nutty as a fruitcake. I mean, this kid was highly toxic before this, paranoid, walking around with a gun, threatening people, and so forth. And Jory went through the program and suffered during the whole program. Most people didn't suffer during the program, by the way. But Jory was severely ill with this. And when he finished up, he had done remarkably well. But at this time, Jory has multiple chemical sensitivities. He cannot put gas in his truck and his van because he's sick, so his wife has to do this. Every now and then he's a hardhead, and every now and then he tries to work with gas or something like that. He gets sick. He started having some severe seizure problems a while back, and the seizures were, he was in church, and in the Presbyterian church, I think it was, and he's having a seizure, and the guy, and the kid in the seat in front of him says, "He's talking in tongues, he's talking in tongues." And Joey says, "I'm not talking in tongues, goddammit, I'm having a seizure." So you'd have to know Jory to see the humor in that. But anyway, it took us a while. He subsequently had seizures in his doctor's office, and it took us a while to realize, for them to realize that it was an aftershave that he'd been putting on, and so forth. And he put it on before he went to church. He put it on before he went to see the doctor, okay? So Jory has gotten progressively worse. I have another patient who is a master cabinet maker from Mississippi. I did not find, let me tell you, the big fault with this, the biggest fault, the doctors, okay? Nobody knows jack doodle about this. And everything I'm telling you would be news to any of the doctors in my community and any of the doctors that I know of. Anywhere, to be honest with you. There are very few doctors that know anything about this or believe anything about this. And it's something that nobody's been, there was a little hostility towards me at first with this because of one of the hospitals definitely has some institutional bias, but not much in my community. Unfortunately, on the Alabama and Mississippi coast, they apparently have gotten to most of the ER people, emergency room people, and so forth, and they treat these patients horribly. This is not coming from me, this is coming from the patients themselves, who go in and have problems. Well, this one friend of mine, it's what friend patients, because they're all my friends these days, the cabinet maker would go to work, I mean, started having these problems that he would lay on the floor. His wife had come home and he was laying on the floor. He couldn't move, he couldn't talk, but he could remember what was going on, as opposed to a true seizure where you lose your memory and so forth. And one of the guys, boy Jory, called that stuck stupid, okay? John didn't particularly like that, but a better term is probably zoned out. The little girl that came to the office and did so well with removing the sheetrock and all, I called it zoned out, and that's a better thing. But the first patient I had with this was a guy that had been working on the site, and he's the guy that told me originally about the using millions of gallons of methanol out there, because he was on a ship that had 30,000 gallon tanks of methanol that they were using during the process. And he describes being on the porch of his home, looking out at his truck. He couldn't move, he couldn't talk, the door was open in the truck, the engine was running, and his son was walking back and forth past him, talking to him, and he couldn't answer him, he couldn't respond to it. Poor John, and so that was the first case of this that I saw and heard about, but we found out subsequently quite a few people have it. The cabinet maker has graduated, and I have a beautiful slide of him having full-blown seizures over here, okay? In which he's sleeping on a recliner, he flips off the recliner on the floor, and the part I don't show in the film, which I can't show you, is him crawling out of the picture. That's the way he lives. Now, he was supposed to come to the program. He's a bit paranoid, and just decided he couldn't do the program. But the patients that we saw originally and treated had phenomenal results, and it was almost universal. A lot of them, when they went back home, developed the same problems, because a lot of them were fishermen and women, and this one family went home and they got sick immediately again, and they were able to buy, because they had some oyster leases and they got some money for losing their leases, they were able to buy some property in Alabama. So the family goes to Alabama, they are perfectly healthy. They come back and go to Venice, Louisiana, in this case it's Port Sulphur, which is close to the same place, and they get sick. The husband gets on the boat, he gets sick, they get off. Other families cannot afford to leave home. They can't sell their homes. the property, you were showing property values, and who's going to buy a damn home in Venice, Louisiana right now? Nobody's foolish enough to do that. This man's picture, the man pictured here today is an 83-year-old friend of mine from California. His name is Kay Kilburn. Dr. Kilburn came down and did some objective studies. I told you that most of the studies that we get on people wouldn't reveal anything, but his studies were designed in such a way. He's been a toxicologist for many years. He retired from the Army as a major and then went into toxicology. And he came down, studied people, and 14 of 14 people he studied were extremely sick. And he told me right before he left, he said, "Mike, I've been doing this for my entire career. This is the worst public health crisis I've experienced in my lifetime." He and I would love to have the resources to be able, not for us to make any money, trust me, to do studies on patients, simple studies. It would not be a tremendously expensive thing, but it'd be the type of thing, and I told him I'd make this offer to you. I'd ask him if it'd be okay. That you could come down and do studies on people and get objective evidence for illnesses. So balance problems, visual problems, reaction times, and many things like that could be tested and so forth, as he did when he came down initially. So if anybody's interested in having this done and can think of some funding sources for it, we'd be glad to come down here and work with you and do anything that we could to help you, because it's one of the few things. Now, would it be acceptable in court? These guys own the court, they own the judges, they own everything. So, but it would be some objective evidence. My dream in this has been all along to be able to write the next chapter in the textbooks, medical texts, showing doctors what could be done and what should be done in these cases, because they don't know, okay? It doesn't take a lot of us are influenced by people telling us things, people that we might respect and so forth, telling us this, that, or whatever else, and we tend to believe it. Well, we've been lied to, and lied to, and lied to, and lied to, and lied to over and over and over again. And, but that would be the wonderful thing. One of the first slides that I saw over here was some original studies that were done, original hearings that were done over here, the first hearing that y'all had over here. And y'all had invited a dear friend of mine and one of my mentors, and her name is Wilma Suber. Wilma's a MacArthur Foundation, Genius Foundation, MacArthur Foundation Genius Award winner. Brilliant, brilliant chemist and so forth, and environmentalist, and populist and so forth. And she's agreed to work with us in these types of things. I haven't talked about specifically about this, but I know she'd be first guy in line because she was the first guy to come down here to address you guys in the first meeting you had. Okay, so this is Dr. Kilburn. He's raring to go. He's only 83 years old now. He's written a couple of books, Chemical Brain Injury and Moles and Mycotoxins. And here we are in Grand Isle, which is the only barrier island in the state of Louisiana. And we've got these shrimp. If you look at the gills of these shrimp, the black spots over here, this crud doesn't belong there, okay? But much of the shrimp population that we've seen over here, which is greatly reduced from what it was before the spill, much of the population has that type of material. Got all kinds of shrimp that don't have eyes and have been deformed in numerous ways and have various and sundry other horrible things expending from their bodies. Okay. This is my buddy, the cabinet maker, who has seizures during this one. Okay, and here's what we saw in Raceland. These are the when I finish my I always at my home even I drink out of a quart mason jar, and so you have to hydrate yourself pretty much when you're in a sauna at 180 degrees for 5 hours. So we took everybody had a jar and put their names on them, and then when they finished up, they put them on the top of the 2 saunas that we used, and so there was 100-something of these jars when we finished up. And these are the 3 amigos, the 3 ladies. One of them, one of these ladies had something like 17 chelation therapies performed, and then another, she had 10 hyperbaric oxygen treatments, and she did, and nothing worked for her, and she did extraordinarily well. And But when she finished with it and went home, she became ill again, and she's got the same problems. What was interesting is she had this facial twist, and you would really be missing a lot by not being able to see this, this thing on tape. But her face was like she had a Bell's palsy or something. One side was completely paralyzed. When we finished up, she was smiling, her face worked beautifully. She had a friend that was one of the other amigos that she was very close to, and they're sitting there in their last interview. The friend could barely walk. She had weakness of one of her legs that was really profound. And when we finished up, she had a little numbness of one of her feet, and that was it. So I'm seeing things that I'd never seen before. We had two ladies with multiple sclerosis, and one of them could barely walk into the waiting room for an interview, initial interview. And when she finished up, and for her to exercise, the best she could do was walk with a matron in my yard to get her exercise. When she finished up, she was on the treadmill for 36 minutes, clipping it. And she's done extraordinarily well. Unlike the others, as far as I know, she is still well. Most of the others have developed this multiple chemical sensitivity and had problems. A second lady had MS, and we weren't treating them for MS, we were treating them for the oil exposure because they both had huge amounts of oil exposure. And when she came in, she was in a walker and she was shuffling maybe 2 or 3 inches at best. She walked out. I know this sounds like some preacher telling you about the miracles that I've seen, but we saw this, I saw it, and we all experienced it. It was a wonderful experience. So we had two people. Dr. Kilburn had explained to me that MS is a new disease. There's nothing about MS in the multiple sclerosis in the history books at all. Nobody had it before. And they believe it's related to mold toxins, and this lady the first lady had a large amount of mold toxin exposure. And one of my last patients was a good friend of my wife and mine who came by, and I didn't have any movies on her, so I just wrote that she had been diagnosed with polymyalgia rheumatica, and then later with Hansen's disease, better known as leprosy. And when they told me, when she came back from a neurologist who told her that she thought she had leprosy, I had to get a little excited because I was responsible for the program. It just so turns out that the National Center for Leprosy is in New Orleans, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, because we used to have the only leper colony in the country in Corville, Louisiana, and they closed it down, and so the main headquarters stayed in Baton Rouge. And the lady assured me that that wasn't the case, and I didn't really need to do anything with it. Later, she was diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis. She had seen 18 different doctors. This girl was sharp as a tack. She used to run 6 or 7 businesses at the same time, and she couldn't run anything. She couldn't remember anything. Her vendors would come in and say, "Becky, what's wrong with you? You don't remember what I told you?" Said, "You're usually on top of things." So she had been 18 different doctors, 40 different medicines, and multiple diagnoses. This is before and after on her legs. Now what had happened, once we thought she had Hansen's disease, she dropped out the program, and I didn't get to see her again. But my wife needed some notary work done one day, and so she asked Becky if she'd meet us at a center that we were at. And so Becky came over, and she walked in, and she looked perfectly normal. I couldn't believe it, and because she could barely walk previously. And apparently the treatment had worked. And so she went to a neurologist, a rheumatologist, I guess it was. And he raised all kinds of hell with her because she had stopped the medicine. Actually, it's an antimetabolite that's used to treat cancer. And he had her on that, and he raised all kind of hell with her because she had stopped the medicine, even though she didn't have the disease that he'd given her the medicine for. And so Becky was not one to bite her tongue, and she raised hell with him back. And they got to be friends again. But here's what happened to her legs with this. And I was just fascinated when she came over and let me film them. And these are the differences that she had. So that's pretty profound. And two ladies with... Okay, and let's get to the politics of this because nobody gives a damn about any of these people. Here's a federal House committee that met in Houma, Louisiana. And I went to it, as I said, my wife is an Indian chief, a very prestigious person in the community, very active leader, and so forth. And here we have the lineup. About 3/4 of these people were people that were testifying on behalf of BP and so forth. And here's my wife giving her part of the testimony, and her part of the testimony obviously was on health issues. When they finished up and they were asking questions, the guy that got most of the questions was the fellow who talked favorably about this fellow Feinsberg, who was the guy that was administering BP's program and was lying to everybody and cheating everybody out of stuff and so forth. And so there was not a single question asked of my wife about the health issues. That was the last thing they were worried about, because these guys were, politically, they had been taken to the outhouse or the what kind of house and told them what they had to do. So, and one of those people, by the way, is a doctor. To the best of my knowledge, and believe me, I know a lot about this, there's not been a penny paid by BP to any patient that I've treated for health issues. They have not compensated a single person with a single nickel for a single bit of illnesses. Now, we've had a couple of deaths in people I've treated. We've had these severe illnesses. This young boy, Joey, I was talking to you about, is incapacitated. And, he's got one problem after another. And I got a call from him a couple of days ago with some severe abdominal problems. I'm worried that he might have some type of GI problems that could be life-threatening, and got into I told him to go to the emergency room immediately with this. And if I could take care of all these problems, I'd be glad to do so, but I'm not qualified to this. So I think the bottom line is this. We had a British corporation that came to the United States, poisoned thousands of Americans, and literally destroyed our coastal environment. Our environment is not what it was in Louisiana, you can imagine. They put this dispersant on this crude oil, and they created a toxic mess. The combination of the dispersant plus the oil is said to be 50 times as toxic as either the oil or the dispersant alone, and so forth. And all of the care, all the health care that's being done for these people is being paid for by us. It's not that they're not just paying for it, we're paying for it. Fortunately for the guys in Louisiana, almost everybody that I've been treating that's disabled completely has gotten Social Security. Guys in Mississippi, it's a political thing, and they're not getting their Social Security. Okay, poor John, who's having seizures right and left, and sick as a dog. It's been 3 years with nothing. So he can't go to the hospital. He can't afford to lose his home. He's got a home and business, and of course he can't work very much with his business. But these are some of the realities of life, and this is why I say the golden rule. The guys with the gold get to make the rules. Okay, everything I've told you today, including those clips, I think the clip on the Grand Bois situation with Ed, the 60 Minutes report, probably isn't on there because I don't know if proprietarily I can do that. But the other things are on, the clips are on this, John's seizures and the Three Amigos, and I've got the letters that I wrote and a lot of what I've done in this issue. It's very simple, drmikeroby.com, and you can pull it up. Okay, and this is about the Plaintiff Steering Committee. Oh, one last thing on the politics. This Plaintiff Steering Committee, this group of 19 attorneys, it turns out that one of the lead attorneys on this, what they call a co-counsel, there are two head knockers on this, other fishermen in my parish, in my community, they represented them. So when they came up with this agreement, the agreement that took all their patients, all their clients, who were my patients, and said their illnesses didn't exist because they're not in the things that are compensable, which means that they didn't exist. So for the public record, there'll be no record of these people being sick. So you talk about cooking the books, they're well cooked. Plus, they got paid millions and millions and millions of dollars to take and shaft their own patients, their own clients, okay? And I'd say this in any public forum, facts are facts, Leroy would back me with this in a minute because that's the case. The people that have been sick, they brought me the paperwork that says, look, we want y'all to join the class so we don't have to go to court on this. And if they join the class, none of their illnesses qualify for compensation. So it's a raw screw job. And I hope, if anything, if nothing else, I've opened your eyes as to what you can expect. So Leroy actually has a master's in admiralty. If anybody could have made money on this thing, it would have been him. It's not what he does, it's not what I do. But, and he predicted pretty much what was going to happen. The only non-prediction that he had was saying that this federal attorney was honest, and I can't say that I agree with him, and he doesn't disagree with me too much anymore on this particular issue. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Have you noticed anything with mental illness?
Yes, irritability, memory loss, fatigability, I mean, just everything. I'm sure these people will have, help me with it, stress syndromes, you know, so forth with this. But I really haven't seen a lot of that particular problem. To be honest with you, and I haven't really thought about it, but these patients that I treated, most of them aren't coming back to me for anything. A lot of them have, those that I have followed up with still have symptoms. Most of them, thank God, have done a lot better. The ones that I have been following up with, that I'm close to, have remained ill. There's one young lady who has a genius IQ. She graduated from Louisiana State School for the Gifted. She worked in the spill. She was told that all of this material was safe. She was a cook. She mopped the floors at all the workers that were cleaning up boats and cleaning the slime and dispersing all off the boats. She mopped the floors barefoot. She washed the clothes of a lot of guys that worked for them, and she cooked for them. And this little girl who's brilliant, on the bayou, we live on the bayous, and all the bayous have similar situations, because there's four directions, and it's north, south, east, and west. It's up the bayou, down the bayou, this side of the bayou, and the other side of the bayou. Okay, so you can't get lost on the bayou too badly. And Jamie, this genius child, has to call people on occasion to come pick her up because she can't find her way home. So that's the way they live. Jory and Jamie both tend to get sick at the same time. I was telling you about earlier that's been having all the seizures. And it seems to be when it rains, they both get sick. So the rain stirs stuff up. We don't know exactly what it is. But it's beside the point what it is. You're sick, okay? All the studies in the world aren't going to negate the fact that you're sick. So my position with this is, forget about all the damn studies that they've got ways to get around them. And they'll have ways to get around what I'm talking about. Let's do some studies on you guys. If we could possibly get some funding to do treatment, that would be wonderful. And I think what I've learned so far is something that you could probably do on a much smaller basis without having to go through a formal program like we had, because we had a formal program. It was a rigid program that you went through, and you had to dot your I's and cross your T's and so forth. I think the rest of this stuff would be available for people otherwise.
You know, Dr. Mike, what's really interesting, what you were talking about earlier in the proceedings, is that when the health department is doing health assessments now on us from Mayflower, and they just started about 3-4 weeks ago. But my personal experience, and I'm not sure about Ann's or the other ones that have been there so far, is that they are checking our ear, nose, and throat. And it surprises me that you are an ear, nose, and throat person, and you're telling us all these things. So, and they're saying that they don't really know what they're looking for, but they do know what they're looking for.
I've never looked at anybody's ear, nose, or throat from the oil spill that had anything wrong that I saw.
Well, see, but they were looking in my...
Well, but they should, okay? And they should look elsewhere. But not much is going to show up. I'm telling you, nothing is going to show up on these studies, okay?
So
it's going to take the studies that Dr. Kilburn does.
So in your studies, are you talking about drawing blood and testing that? And all
No, I did about 100, I drew blood on about 100 people for volatile organic compounds, okay? And like I told you earlier, I didn't talk to a single person about the results. I'm not qualified in that area. It's not what I do. I'm a clinician and so forth. And I'm not treating a whole lot of people for these problems. Occasionally I had another man come in recently with classic VP syndrome. And I've been treating him, but we haven't, it's been just at the beginning of this. And most of the people don't have enough money to bring this on for for a prolonged period of time. They just don't have insurance, they're unable to work and so forth. This stuff hit my people hard. I mean, it just didn't do well. So, yes, ma'am.
A couple of questions. One, did you use the Metamatrix volatile solvents profile? Do you vet that? Do you think that's a good?
Yeah, as far as I know, it's
Okay.
a gold standard, I think, is from what I've heard.
Okay.
I wouldn't swear to that, though.
Okay.
But Dr. Subaru would be the guy you could speak to about it, because Dr. Subaru is the one who I'd send some of these to Mary Lee Orr of the Louisiana Environmental Action Network. They paid for it.
Right.
And the other ones, we go to Wilma Subaru. And so I don't know who went to who, but I refused to do it because it's not I didn't want to be called in as an expert in something I didn't know very much.
And the other question was, the three ladies happen to be part of CHSL? Kendra or?
Kim Diagono.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Kim, I shouldn't use her name, but
Right.
Kim went to, they had a condominium, and Ken was one of the people that his family had a little money, and they had a condominium in Destin. And her third trip to Destin, every time she went there, she got sick, and she got sicker, but she didn't relate it to the swimming. And the third time she went there, it knocked her for a loop. And she came back, and she had every system you can imagine was out of whack. She saw all kind of doctors, got all kind of treatment, and so forth. Kim was another one that had to leave the program early, and I didn't get to see her finish the program. When I called her about a year later to see how she was doing, thinking that she probably was still sick because she hadn't finished, she was doing sensationally well, okay?
Good.
Another one was a fisherwoman who I told y'all had gotten really sick, and they bought a place in Alabama, and they do great when they go home. The third one of the three amigos was a lady with the twisted face, and she took a trip with the second one and went to spend a couple of weeks with her in Alabama. Did very well when she was over there.
Good.
And on the way home, she got sick again. Those couples had gone to I'm overstaying my welcome, I'm afraid right now, forgive me. I'll finish on this. These couples had gone to somewhere in Tennessee, and it was two couples it was the lady, the fisherwoman, and another couple, and her husband, another couple, had gone to Tennessee. And they got out of their car at their hotel, and both of them got sick. One of them started having bleeding from all over, the other one was vomiting and so forth. They were they were paving a parking lot, they were blacktopping the parking lot. Well, one of these ladies had read where BP has a huge asphalt business in the United States. They have this huge asphalt business, and BP also has been using some of the oil from the spill to make asphalt. I'm sure that the asphalt itself could have caused them to be sick, but you know, the potential for it being that is just adding insult to injury. So, thank you so very much. I've been wanting to meet you guys. If there's anything I can help you with, this lovely lady over here, Miss Emily, can give you my email address, and I'd be glad to correspond with you in any way and help in any way that I can. Thank you.